Sarah Martinez had always been the reliable one at Morrison & Associates law firm. For 3 years she arrived early, stayed late, and never missed a deadline. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet but brilliant paralegal who could research cases faster than anyone else in the office. She wore long sleeves even in summer, kept to herself during lunch breaks, and politely declined invitations to office parties. On that particular Tuesday morning in September, Sarah rushed through the glass doors of the downtown office building, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. She was 20 minutes late, which was completely unlike her. Her supervisor, Janet, looked up from her desk with raised eyebrows as Sarah hurried past, mumbling apologies while clutching a stack of case files against her chest. David Chen, the newest junior associate, had been watching Sarah for weeks. Fresh out of law school and full of confidence, he found her mysterious behavior intriguing yet frustrating. In his mind, people who were always punctual and then suddenly weren't were simply making excuses. He had grown up in a privileged household, where accountability meant everything, and lateness was considered disrespectful. As Sarah settled at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged her papers, David approached with a case file. He noticed she was wearing another long-sleeved blouse despite the warm weather, and her usually neat hair looked hastily arranged. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she seemed to be favoring her left side. "Rough morning?" David asked, his tone carrying a hint of judgment. "Traffic must have been terrible to make someone as punctual as you run late." Sarah looked up briefly, forcing a smile. "Yes, something like that. I'm sorry, I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." David leaned against her desk, studying her face. "You know, Sarah, reliability is everything in this business. Clients depend on us to be here, to be sharp, to be present. When we start making excuses for being late, it becomes a habit." The words stung more than David could have imagined. Sarah's grip tightened on her pen, and she could feel the familiar ache spreading across her back and shoulders. The previous night had been particularly difficult. The thunderstorm that rolled through the city had triggered another episode, sending her mind racing back to places she fought daily to forget. "I understand," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't happen again." David noticed how she seemed to shrink into herself, but he interpreted it as guilt rather than pain. In his experience, people who made mistakes needed to be held accountable, not coddled. His father had taught him that success came from discipline and showing up regardless of circumstances. "Look, I'm not trying to be harsh," David continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But in law, excuses don't hold up in court. We need to maintain professional standards." Sarah nodded, focusing intently on the document in front of her, hoping he would walk away. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed unusually bright, and she could feel the beginning of another headache forming behind her eyes. The scars hidden beneath her sleeves seemed to throb with each word David spoke. Other colleagues in the office began to take notice of the conversation. Jenny from accounting glanced over sympathetically, having always liked Sarah's gentle nature. Mark, another paralegal, frowned at David's lecturing tone but continued with his work, not wanting to interfere. "I've been watching your work," David said, apparently not finished with his impromptu performance review. "You're talented, Sarah, but talent means nothing without consistency. My law professor used to say that showing up is half the battle." What David didn't know was that for Sarah, showing up every day was indeed half the battle. It was a victory she achieved despite the nightmares that jolted her awake at 3 a.m, despite the phantom sounds of explosions that echoed in her mind during quiet moments, despite the physical pain that radiated through her body on days when the weather changed or stress mounted. Sarah had learned to compartmentalize her past, to function in the present while carrying wounds that refused to heal completely. Her morning routine involved carefully applying concealer to scars, choosing clothing that covered the evidence of her previous life, and practicing the smile she would wear throughout the day. "I appreciate your feedback," Sarah managed to say, though her voice sounded strained. "I really do need to get back to this research now." David finally pushed himself away from her desk, satisfied that he had made his point. As he walked back to his office, he felt pleased with himself for addressing what he saw as a potential problem before it became a bigger issue. In his mind, he had been helpful. even mentoring, though he couldn't understand why Sarah seemed so affected by his constructive criticism. Sarah waited until she heard David's office door close before allowing herself to breathe deeply. Her hands were shaking more noticeably now, and she clasped them together under her desk. The morning's episode had been triggered by a car backfiring outside her apartment building, a sound that instantly transported her back to a dusty road in Afghanistan where her life had changed forever. She touched the spot on her shoulder where the largest piece of shrapnel still remained, too close to vital nerves for doctors to safely remove. The metal fragment served as a permanent reminder of the day her convoy hit an improvised explosive device, the day that ended her military career and began her long journey toward building a new life. The following weeks at Morrison & Associates became increasingly tense for Sarah. David's comments about reliability and professionalism had created an atmosphere where every small mistake felt magnified. She found herself double-checking everything, arriving even earlier than usual, and staying later to ensure her work was beyond reproach. However, the invisible wound she carried made consistency a daily struggle. Some mornings Sarah would wake up drenched in sweat from nightmares that transported her back to the moment when her life changed forever. Other days, the chronic pain from her injuries would flare up, making it difficult to concentrate or move without discomfort. David, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to monitor Sarah's performance more closely. He genuinely believed he was helping her improve, not realizing that his constant scrutiny was adding pressure to someone already fighting battles he couldn't see. During team meetings, he would make pointed comments about punctuality and dependability, often while looking directly at Sarah. In litigation, there's no room for personal issues to interfere with professional obligations, David announced during one particularly uncomfortable staff meeting. Our clients trust us to be present, both physically and mentally, regardless of what might be happening in our personal lives. Sarah felt every word like a physical blow. What David called personal issues were the lingering effects of serving her country overseas, of surviving an attack that killed 2 of her fellow soldiers and left her with injuries both visible and hidden. The trauma wasn't something she could simply leave at home like a bad mood or a minor inconvenience. Janet, the office supervisor, began to notice the dynamic between David and Sarah. She had always appreciated Sarah's quiet competence and dedication, but lately, she seemed more withdrawn and anxious. During their monthly one-on-one meeting, Janet decided to address her concerns directly. Sarah, you've been with us for 3 years, and your work has always been exceptional, Janet began, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. Lately, though, you seem stressed. Is everything all right? Sarah hesitated, her fingers automatically moving to adjust her sleeve, ensuring it completely covered the scars on her forearm. She had never discussed her military background with anyone at the office, preferring to keep her past separate from her current life. The transition from soldier to civilian had been difficult enough without adding the complexity of workplace sympathy or unwanted questions. I'm fine. Really? Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. I know I was late that morning a few weeks ago, and I understand that it created concerns about my reliability. I'm working hard to ensure it doesn't happen again. Janet frowned, sensing there was more to the story. Sarah, one late morning in 3 years hardly constitutes a pattern. You're one of our most dependable employees. I'm more concerned about the pressure you seem to be putting on yourself lately. Before Sarah could respond, David knocked on the open door, interrupting their conversation. Janet, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to follow up on the Peterson case research. Sarah, have you finished reviewing those deposition transcripts? Almost, Sarah replied, turning back to her computer screen. I should have the summary ready within the hour. David nodded but remained in the doorway. Good. Consistency in meeting deadlines is crucial for maintaining client confidence. I'm sure you understand the importance of staying on top of these timelines. After David left, Janet studied Sarah's face carefully. She noticed how the young woman's shoulders had tensed during the brief interaction, how her breathing had become more shallow. Something was clearly affecting Sarah beyond normal workplace stress. Has David been giving you additional feedback about your work? Janet asked gently. Sarah chose her words carefully. He's been helpful in pointing out areas where I can improve my professionalism. I appreciate his guidance. What Sarah didn't mention was how David's constant reminders about reliability triggered her deepest fears about being seen as weak or unreliable. In the military, showing weakness could get people killed. The transition to civilian life had required learning new ways to cope with challenges. But David's criticism felt like a judgment of her fundamental worth as a person. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment staring at the framed photograph on her nightstand. It showed her unit during a brief moment of downtime, everyone smiling despite the harsh conditions. She could still remember each person's name, their stories, their dreams for after deployment. 2 of those faces belonged to soldiers who never made it home. The guilt was sometimes overwhelming. Why had she survived when others hadn't? The doctors called it survivor's guilt, explaining that it was a common response to traumatic events. Understanding the psychology behind her feelings didn't make them easier to bear, especially when someone like David questioned her dedication or reliability. Sarah touched the spot on her shoulder where the shrapnel remained embedded, a constant reminder of that terrible day. The explosion had happened so quickly that her memories of the actual event remained fragmented. She remembered the sound of the engine, casual conversation between team members, and then an earth-shattering boom that changed everything. The physical recovery had taken months, involving multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. The emotional recovery was still ongoing, requiring therapy sessions that helped her develop coping strategies for triggers and traumatic stress responses. Some days were better than others, but David's criticism had made the workplace feel less safe, less predictable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her therapist, Dr. Williams, reminding her about their appointment the following day. Sarah had been seeing Dr. Williams for 2 years, working through the complex process of healing from combat trauma. The sessions had helped tremendously, but recent workplace stress had brought back some symptoms she thought she had overcome. As Sarah prepared for bed, she practiced the breathing exercises Dr. Williams had taught her, trying to quiet the anxiety that David's words had stirred up. Tomorrow would bring another day of proving herself, another day of hiding the reality of her struggles behind the facade of professional competence. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in October. Sarah had endured another sleepless night, jolted awake repeatedly by nightmares that left her heart racing and her clothes soaked with perspiration. The approaching anniversary of the explosion always made her symptoms worse, though she had never shared this detail with anyone at work. She arrived at the office only 5 minutes late, but those 5 minutes felt like a catastrophic failure in her mind. David was waiting near the elevator, checking his watch with an expression of disappointment that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Sarah, we need to talk," David said as they rode up together. "This pattern of tardiness is becoming a real concern. I've been patient, but patience has limits in a professional environment." Sarah stared at the elevator buttons, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. "I understand your concern, David. I'm doing my best to address the issue." "Are you, though?" David's voice carried a sharp edge that made other people in the elevator turn to look. "Because frankly, doing your best should mean showing up on time every time. It's not complicated." When the elevator doors opened, Sarah hurried to her desk while David continued his lecture in front of several colleagues. "In my opinion, this comes down to priorities," he announced loudly enough for half the office to hear. When people consistently make excuses for basic professional expectations, it raises questions about their commitment. Mark, the paralegal who worked near Sarah, finally spoke up. "David, maybe you could have this conversation privately instead of broadcasting it to the entire office." David turned toward Mark with a condescending smile. "I appreciate your concern, but accountability shouldn't be hidden behind closed doors. When someone's behavior affects team morale and professional standards, it becomes everyone's business." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. The fluorescent light seemed too bright, the voices too loud, and the space too small. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as her body prepared for a fight-or-flight response that had kept her alive in combat, but felt overwhelming in an office environment. "I need some air," Sarah whispered, grabbing her purse and heading toward the stairwell. She could hear David calling after her, probably with more criticism about leaving during work hours, but she couldn't stop moving. In the stairwell, Sarah sat on the concrete steps and tried to implement the grounding techniques Dr. Williams had taught her. She pressed her palms against the cool wall, focusing on the texture and temperature. She counted backwards from 100, naming 5 things she could see, 4 things she could touch, 3 things she could hear. But David's words kept echoing in her mind. Making excuses. Commitment. Professional standards. Each phrase felt like an accusation that she was fundamentally flawed, that her struggles invalidated her worth as a person and an employee. After 20 minutes, Sarah returned to her desk to find a handwritten note from David, placed prominently on her keyboard. Sarah, we need to schedule a formal meeting to discuss your attendance issues and develop an improvement plan. Please see me this afternoon. David. The note felt like a final judgment, confirmation that she had failed to successfully transition from military to civilian life. Sarah folded the paper carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, next to the small American flag pin she had worn on her uniform. That afternoon, David had prepared what he considered a constructive conversation about workplace expectations. He had researched company policies about tardiness and prepared a list of suggestions for better time management. In his mind, he was being helpful and professional. Sarah, I want to start by saying that I respect your work quality, David began as they sat in the small conference room. Your research is thorough, your writing is clear, and clients appreciate your attention to detail. However, reliability encompasses more than just work product. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I understand that punctuality is important. I've been working on strategies to improve my morning routine. David leaned forward, adopting what he believed was an encouraging tone. That's good to hear. But I think we need to address the root cause of these issues. If there are personal challenges affecting your ability to meet basic professional obligations, perhaps you should consider whether this is the right environment for you. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything she had overcome, after rebuilding her life from scratch, David was suggesting she might not belong in the career she had worked so hard to establish. The implication that her struggles made her unsuitable for professional life felt like a denial of her fundamental worth. I've never missed a deadline, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible. My work has never been late or substandard. That's true, David acknowledged. But workplace performance includes more than just meeting deadlines. It includes being present, being reliable, being someone your colleagues can count on regardless of personal circumstances. Personal circumstances. The phrase stuck in Sarah's throat like a stone. David had reduced her military service, her injuries, her ongoing recovery, to mere personal circumstances that should be easily manageable by any dedicated professional. David, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength, you don't know anything about my personal circumstances. You're right. I don't, David replied, and frankly, I don't need to. That's the point of professionalism. We don't bring our personal lives into the workplace. We show up, we do our jobs, we maintain standards regardless of what might be happening outside these walls. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. For the first time since David had begun his campaign of criticism, she looked directly into his eyes. Some personal circumstances, she said carefully, leave marks that don't just disappear when you walk through office doors. David misinterpreted her steady gaze as defiance rather than pain. Sarah, everyone has challenges. Everyone has bad days or difficult situations. The difference between successful professionals and everyone else is the ability to compartmentalize those issues and maintain consistent performance. The word compartmentalize echoed in Sarah's mind. She had been compartmentalizing for years, separating her past from her present, her pain from her productivity, her trauma from her daily tasks. David's criticism suggested that her compartmentalization wasn't good enough, that the occasional spillover of her struggles into her professional life made her unsuitable for the career she loved. The tension in the office reached a breaking point the following Monday. Sarah had spent the weekend agonizing over David's suggestion that she might not be suitable for the workplace, questioning everything she had rebuilt since leaving the military. She arrived at work 15 minutes early, determined to prove that she belonged there. David, however, had apparently decided that their previous conversation hadn't been direct enough. During the weekly staff meeting, he brought up what he called team accountability in a way that everyone understood was directed at Sarah. I want to discuss the importance of reliability in our profession, David announced to the assembled group. When one team member consistently struggles with basic expectations like punctuality, it affects everyone's workload and morale. Sarah felt her face flush with humiliation as colleagues glanced in her direction. Jenny from accounting looked uncomfortable. Mark appeared angry. And even Janet seemed surprised by David's public approach to what should have been a private matter. Furthermore, David continued, clearly warming to his topic, I think we need to be honest about the fact that some people simply aren't cut out for the demands of legal work. It requires discipline, consistency, and the ability to prioritize professional obligations over personal convenience. The phrase personal convenience was the final straw. Sarah's hands began to tremble as the familiar surge of adrenaline flooded her system. The careful walls she had built around her past began to crumble under the weight of David's relentless judgment. Excuse me, Sarah said, her voice cutting through David's speech. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, surprised by the interruption. What exactly do you consider personal convenience? David paused, apparently pleased that Sarah was finally engaging in what he saw as a necessary confrontation. Well, Sarah, I think that's something you need to examine for yourself. We all have responsibilities outside of work, but successful professionals don't let those responsibilities interfere with their job performance. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair rolling backward. The room fell completely silent as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. You want to know about my responsibilities, David? About my personal circumstances? Sarah, Janet interjected gently, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond a normal workplace discussion. Maybe we should continue this conversation privately. But Sarah was beyond the point of private conversations. Months of criticism, judgment, and implications about her character had finally reached their limit. No, Janet, David has made this everyone's business. He wants to discuss my reliability, my commitment, my inability to prioritize professional obligations. David sensed that he was losing control of the situation, but his pride prevented him from backing down. Sarah, I'm simply trying to help you understand the standards expected in a professional environment. Standards, Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger. Let me tell you about standards, David. Let me tell you about showing up every day despite waking up in terror from nightmares about watching your friends die. Let me tell you about professional commitment when your body carries permanent reminders of serving your country. The room was so quiet that the humming of the air conditioning seemed loud. David's confident expression began to falter as he realized the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Sarah began unbuttoning the cuffs of her long-sleeved blouse, her movements deliberate and controlled. You want to know why I'm sometimes late? Why I occasionally need a moment to collect myself? Why your lectures about personal convenience feel like insults? Sarah, you don't need to, Mark started to say, but she held up her hand to stop him. No, I do need to, Sarah said firmly, because apparently my work quality, my dedication, and my 3 years of reliable service mean nothing if I'm occasionally 5 minutes late due to what David considers personal convenience. She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a network of scars that crisscrossed her forearm like a map of violence. The room collectively held its breath as the evidence of Sarah's hidden struggles became visible. Some scars were thin and precise, clearly from surgical procedures. Others were jagged and irregular, telling the story of metal fragments that had torn through flesh and muscle. These are from an IED explosion in Afghanistan, Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the emotional magnitude of the moment. I was serving as a communications specialist with the Army when our convoy hit an improvised explosive device. 2 of my fellow soldiers died that day. I survived, but not without permanent reminders. David's face had gone pale, his previous confidence completely evaporated. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words. Sarah rolled up her right sleeve, revealing similar scarring. The shrapnel removal required 6 surgeries. Some pieces couldn't be safely extracted and remain embedded in my shoulder and back. They shift sometimes, causing pain that makes it difficult to sleep. Weather changes affect them. Stress makes them worse. She turned to face David directly, her eyes blazing with controlled fury. The nightmares aren't personal convenience, David. They're post-traumatic stress from surviving combat. The occasional tardiness isn't lack of commitment. It's the result of managing invisible wounds that you couldn't possibly understand. Jenny from accounting had tears in her eyes. Mark looked like he wanted to punch something. Janet sat frozen in her chair, clearly processing the revelation that one of her employees had been carrying this burden alone. But you want to know the really interesting part? Sarah continued, her voice gaining power. Despite everything I deal with every single day, I've never missed a deadline. I've never produced substandard work. I've never failed to meet the actual requirements of my job. The only thing I've occasionally struggled with is arriving exactly on time, and for that, you've questioned my character, my commitment, and my suitability for this profession. David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Sarah, I had no idea. I'm sorry, I didn't know about your service or your injuries. No, you didn't know, Sarah agreed, beginning to roll her sleeves back down. And you didn't ask. You didn't consider that there might be legitimate reasons for occasional struggles. You simply assumed that any deviation from your standard of perfection indicated personal weakness or lack of dedication. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone present was processing not only the revelation of Sarah's military service and injuries, but also the implications of David's months-long campaign of criticism against someone who had already sacrificed so much. The conference room remained silent for what felt like an eternity after Sarah's revelation. David sat motionless, staring at the table as the full weight of his behavior over the past month settled in his mind. The confident junior associate who had lectured about professionalism and reliability now faced the reality that he had been harassing a decorated veteran struggling with combat injuries. Janet was the first to break the silence. Sarah, she said softly, I wish you had felt comfortable sharing this with us sooner. We could have made accommodations, provided support. Sarah shook her head slowly. I didn't want accommodations. I wanted to be judged on my work, not my past. I wanted to prove that I could succeed in civilian life without special treatment or sympathy. But you shouldn't have had to endure criticism for issues related to your service, Janet replied, glancing meaningfully at David. That's not acceptable in any workplace, especially when your actual job performance has been exemplary. David finally looked up from the table, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. Sarah, I owe you a massive apology. I was completely wrong about everything. I made assumptions and judgments without knowing anything about your situation. Your apology is noted, Sarah replied coolly, but the damage has been done. For months you've questioned my character, my dedication, and my suitability for this profession. You've made my workplace feel hostile and unwelcoming. An apology doesn't erase the stress and humiliation you've caused. Mark, who had been quietly seething throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. David, what you did was harassment, plain and simple. You targeted Sarah for months based on absolutely nothing. I thought I was helping, David said weakly, though the words sounded hollow even to him. I thought I was providing constructive feedback about professional standards. You thought wrong, Sarah said firmly. You took it upon yourself to monitor and criticize someone whose work was already exceeding standards. You made assumptions about my character without knowing anything about my background or circumstances. Jenny wiped tears from her eyes before speaking. Sarah, I had no idea what you were going through. You've always been so professional, so composed. I can't imagine dealing with all of that while maintaining the quality of work you produce. The praise felt bittersweet to Sarah. She had worked so hard to appear normal, to blend in, to prove that her past didn't define her limitations. The effort had been exhausting, and David's criticism had made it feel futile. The worst part, Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with pain, is that you made me question myself. You made me wonder if I really was unsuitable for civilian professional life. After everything I've overcome, you almost convinced me that my struggles made me unworthy of the career I've worked so hard to build. David winced as if he had been physically struck. Sarah, that was never my intention. I truly believed I was helping you improve. Your intentions don't matter when the impact is harmful, Sarah replied. You don't get to harass someone for months and then claim good intentions as a defense. Janet cleared her throat, recognizing that the situation required immediate action. David, I need to see you in my office after this meeting. We need to discuss the appropriateness of your behavior and determine next steps. Of course, David said quietly, finally beginning to understand the professional consequences of his actions. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, people she had worked alongside for 3 years without ever sharing the most significant part of her background. I want everyone to understand that I'm not sharing this for sympathy or special treatment. I'm sharing it because David's behavior has made it impossible to continue hiding the reality of my situation. Your military service is something to be proud of, Mark said firmly. You served your country and paid a significant price for that service. The fact that you've built a successful career despite your injuries is remarkable. I don't need to be remarkable, Sarah replied with a tired smile. I just need to be allowed to do my job without someone constantly questioning my commitment based on superficial observations. David sat in his chair, looking smaller than he had moments before. His entire perception of the situation had been turned upside down. The colleague he had viewed as making excuses was actually someone who had served in combat. The person he had criticized for lack of commitment was someone who showed up to work every day despite dealing with injuries and trauma that would have derailed many people completely. Sarah, David said hesitantly, is there anything I can do to make this right? I know my apology isn't enough, but I want to do whatever I can to repair the damage I've caused. Sarah considered his question carefully. You can start by examining your own assumptions about people. You can stop appointing yourself as the office monitor of other people's behavior, and you can remember that everyone you work with has a story you don't know. I will, David promised, though he knew his words carried little weight after months of harmful behavior. Janet stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. I think we all need some time to process this conversation. Sarah, please know that you have the full support of management and will be implementing changes to ensure this type of situation never happens again. As people began to file out of the conference room, several colleagues stopped to speak with Sarah. Jenny squeezed her shoulder gently. Mark shook her hand and thanked her for her service. Others simply offered quiet words of support and respect. David remained seated until the room was nearly empty, then approached Sarah cautiously. I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I have enormous respect for your service and your strength. I was completely wrong about everything. Sarah looked at him for a long moment before responding. David, I hope you learn from this experience. I hope you remember that everyone around you is fighting battles you can't see. Your privilege of not having to deal with trauma doesn't give you the right to judge those who do. 6 months after the confrontation in the conference room, the atmosphere at Morrison & Associates had fundamentally changed. Sarah's revelation had sparked important conversations about workplace culture, unconscious bias, and supporting employees with invisible disabilities. Janet had implemented new training programs focusing on respectful workplace behavior and recognizing that every employee brings unique challenges and strengths to their role. Sarah herself had experienced an unexpected transformation. Initially, she had worried that revealing her military background would change how colleagues viewed her, possibly leading to unwanted sympathy or different treatment. Instead, she found that honesty had created deeper connections with her coworkers and allowed her to be more authentic in her daily interactions. The office dynamics had shifted significantly. Jenny from accounting had become a close friend, often joining Sarah for lunch and sharing her own stories about overcoming personal challenges. Mark continued to be supportive, occasionally checking in to make sure Sarah felt comfortable in the workplace. Even new employees quickly learned that Morrison & Associates was a place where people were valued for their contributions rather than judged for their struggles. David's experience had been more complicated. Janet had placed him on probation and required him to attend sensitivity training and professional development courses focused on workplace harassment and diversity awareness. The consequences had been a harsh wake-up call about the impact of his behavior. More importantly, David had begun a process of serious self-reflection. He had grown up in an environment where success was measured by visible achievements and any sign of struggle was seen as weakness. Sarah's story had forced him to confront the privilege of his upbringing and the assumptions he had carried into professional life. During one of their required check-in meetings, David had asked Janet how he could make amends for his behavior. I understand that apologizing isn't enough, he had said. I want to do something meaningful to show that I've learned from this experience. Janet had been direct in her response. David, the best thing you can do is become an advocate for the kind of workplace culture that supports all employees. Use your privilege and position to speak up when you see others being treated unfairly. David had taken her advice seriously. When a new paralegal started at the firm and seemed to be struggling with confidence, David made an effort to be encouraging rather than critical. When he overheard colleagues making dismissive comments about someone's performance, he spoke up to suggest they consider factors they might not be aware of. The change in David's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Sarah had observed his efforts to be more thoughtful and inclusive, though she remained cautious about trusting someone who had caused her so much stress. Forgiveness, she had learned in therapy, was a process rather than a single decision. Dr. Williams, Sarah's therapist, had been proud of Sarah's decision to reveal her background at work. "You chose authenticity over protection," Dr. Williams had observed. "That takes enormous courage, especially for someone who has experienced trauma." The therapeutic process had helped Sarah understand that hiding her struggles hadn't been weakness, but survival. In the military and during her early civilian transition, concealing her pain had been necessary for moving forward. However, David's harassment had shown her that complete concealment could leave her vulnerable to misunderstanding and judgment. Sarah's work performance had actually improved after the revelation. Without the exhausting effort of constantly hiding her reality, she had more energy to devote to her cases. She had also become more comfortable asking for minor accommodations when needed, such as requesting afternoon meetings on days when morning pain flares made early commitments difficult. The law firm had implemented several policy changes as a result of Sarah's experience. New employee orientation now included sessions about invisible disabilities and the importance of respectful workplace communication. Managers received training about recognizing signs of harassment and creating inclusive environments for all employees. Janet had also established a confidential support system where employees could report concerns about workplace treatment without fear of retaliation. The goal was to address problems before they escalated to the level of Sarah's experience. One afternoon in spring, Sarah was working on a particularly complex case when David approached her desk hesitantly. Over the months, their interactions had been minimal and purely professional, which suited Sarah perfectly. "Sarah," David said quietly, "I wanted to let you know that I'll be leaving Morrison & Associates next month. I've accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that provides legal services to veterans." Sarah looked up from her computer, surprised by both the news and David's choice of new employment. "That's quite a career change," she observed neutrally. "It is," David agreed. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I want my career to mean, what kind of impact I want to have. Working with veterans feels like a way to honor the service of people like you, and maybe make amends for my previous ignorance." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation, but David seemed genuinely changed by their experience. "I hope you approach that work with the humility you've developed here," she said carefully. "I will," David promised. "I've learned that everyone has a story, and my job is to listen and support, not to judge or criticize." As David walked away, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey their conflict had created. She would never be grateful for the harassment she had endured, but she could acknowledge that the eventual resolution had led to positive changes for everyone involved. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the office, she looked around at the workspace that had once felt hostile but now felt genuinely supportive. She had proven to herself that she could succeed in civilian professional life, not despite her military experience and injuries, but as a complete person whose struggles and strengths were both part of her story. The scars on her arms were still there, permanent reminders of service and sacrifice, but they no longer felt like secrets she had to hide. They were simply part of who she was, a veteran, a survivor, a skilled professional, and a person worthy of respect regardless of the battles she continued to fight every day.